Okay. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Julius Krein. I'm the editor of American Affairs, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this discussion on Australia's news media bargaining code and implications for U.S. policy. I'll just begin by saying that I find this topic absolutely fascinating, even though it often seems to not get much media attention, paradoxically enough. But it touches on so many critical issues. First, of course, is the direct media application. I won't read all the dismal statistics, but since 2005, about 2,500 newspapers in the United States have closed. That's about 25% of the total. Employment is down by 70%. And many areas have little or no local news outlets anymore, which obviously raises serious questions about sustaining an informed public. Beyond the direct effect on the media, this issue touches on the fundamentals of the internet economy, big tech, antitrust, privacy, political censorship, and so many other areas. It's also interesting, I think, from the US perspective. I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but since the 1996 Telecommunications Act, it's often seemed like any major legislation that would affect or change the major components of the internet economy has basically been off the table. And so it's very interesting for us in the US to look at other major pieces of legislation that touch these issues around the world and see their responses and ramifications. The Australia News Bargaining Code, of course, isn't the only such example. South Korea had an interesting App Store bill. But the Australian Bargaining Code is certainly one of the first and most significant interventions on media issues and other big tech elements of the internet economy. It's also inspired, I think it's fair to say, a range of similar legislation around the world, not least in the United States. Last year, we had the JCPA, Journalism Competition Preservation Act, which did not pass, but did attract pretty significant bipartisan support. And the California state legislature is currently contemplating their own JCPA, which is slightly different, but perhaps we'll talk about that. So I'm really looking forward to getting into these topics in this discussion. A couple of housekeeping items. First, I want to thank the Knight Foundation for their support of this symposium and this discussion. I encourage you to check out their other work on journalism, technology, and other issues at knightfoundation.org. Also, for the audience on the live stream, the easiest way for you to submit questions is probably to just leave a comment in the chat on the live stream. If you really want to impress me, you can also just email them to events@americanaffairsjournal.org. And thanks also to those of you who submitted the questions in the pre-registration. We'll get through as many as we can. On that note, one of our panelists, Krewson, will have to depart a bit early. He'll be speaking in the first part here, but if you have any specific questions for him, please submit those while he is speaking. So without further ado, let me introduce our fairly large panel. I will be very brief, and of course their biographies and bibliographies are all much more substantial. But we have Professor Terry Flew from the University of Sydney in Australia, Chris Krewson of Lion Publishers, Josh Hammer from Newsweek, Sohrab Ahmari of Compact Magazine, Matt Stoller from the American Economic Liberties Project, and Peter Lewis from the Center for Responsible Technology in Australia. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Terry, I'd like to start with you, if I could. Your contribution to the symposium was a very rigorous scholarly piece, sort of summarizing the formation of the bargaining code in the first 2 years or so of its implementation. Maybe for the purposes of this discussion, I just ask for your subjective impressions of how things are going so far. What do you think's working? What isn't working? Any big surprises? How's public opinion responding? The media companies, big tech, just your impressions of how things are going in the first 2 years or so.
Okay, thanks very much, Julius, and thanks for convening the panel. What I would say in the Australian context is that Australia had a change of government last year, and I'm not seeing any signs that this legislation is going off the table in a hurry. So that's to say that the commitment to it is politically bipartisan, and I think that's the case because around the world we have a problem. We have a problem around the sustainability of non-publicly funded news, and that these century-long nexus between advertising and news production is now very much damaged, and it's probably fair to say you'll get a debate there about to what extent was this the news organisations not adequately responding to the challenge of the internet, and to what extent is it that their frenemy relationships with the digital platforms have come to bite them. But nonetheless, there is a question: who will fund news in the future? And I think part of the appeal of this legislation is that it points to a way in which news can be funded by means other than advertising, which doesn't require the government to directly fund it itself. Noting that in Australia, the federal government puts at least $1 billion into news production through its support for public service media. So I think that while the challenges remain, and I think we probably want to get into discussion about the platform companies' perspectives on the legislation shortly. While the challenges remain, it has proved to be, to some degree, an elegant response to the question of who funds the production of news in the wake of declining advertising revenue that doesn't require the government to further fund the production of news itself.
Chris, I'd like to turn to you next, and you can perhaps say a bit more about Lion Publishers if you like, but suffice it to say that no one will accuse you of indifference to the plight of the media. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I also think that your contribution to the symposium perhaps expressed the most skepticism toward what we might call the Australian approach or the JCPA approach, and perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on why you think this is the wrong solution to the problem.
Yeah, I think I'd sum up my thinking in that, like, I kind of don't think the goal of legislation should be to help any one organization. It should be the outcome should be to help journalism. And I haven't seen a slowdown in the closure of newspapers in Australia. I haven't seen a slowdown of the creation of news deserts there. If this was going to save journalism, I think we'd see some early signs it was going to save journalism. And instead, I wouldn't call the ecosystem any more stable. I come to that because Lion's members, stateside, are small publications, small businesses, often starting their publications after they've been laid off or bought out or lost their job in some other sort of contraction of this industry, which has been in a relentless decline since before 2005. I started as a journalist in 1998, which maybe was like the heyday, but the free fall for advertising in journalism started when Walter Cronkite tuned in and started in broadcast news. And I don't recall any legislation at the time that asked the networks to share that advertising money with newspapers at the time. So I think what happens in the case of Australia, and by the way, we actually don't know how much money is changing hands, is another sort of interesting part of this. It's all sort of done in secretly with side deals that are under the table. And so it's not clear at all what's happening. But what has happened for the first time is a government has told a business that it has to share its profits with an industry that lost them, which is fascinating. And kind of an interesting precedent if you think about all the different disruption that's happened through almost every other industry in existence. So, I say that from this perspective because this legislation is very clearly written for publishers of means, not for new businesses that are starting. There are various revenue floors that preempt very small publishers from taking advantage of it. Those who have, put their personal stake in launching a business are not what this is written to do, right? To support. It also happens that a lot of those are publishers of color, and they're usually not what this is written to help either. So count me as a skeptic, and I think the optimistic part is that you have legislators of both parties that agree that something needs to be done about the news crisis, the local news crisis in particular. I have incredible doubts that this is going to move the needle. I just also don't think it's enough money to make a difference, because it's a tourniquet on one vein, and they're in multiple organ failure, these publishers. So that is on that rather mixed metaphor, I will hit mute.
Well, since you have to depart early, I'm gonna front load the question and maybe just ask a follow-up, which is, what approaches or solutions would you like to see that you think might be a more effective remedy?
Yeah, I think I'm encouraged by some stuff that we've seen at the state level in different places. New Jersey has a civic information bill that's done some good work. California has a journalism fellowship program. They allocated $25 million and are working with the University of Berkeley to place journalists around the state. Those are very worthwhile and encouraging efforts that really do the act of legislating from the outcome that they'd like to see, which is more journalism, specifically in underserved communities, which I think, Lion Publishers is a nonprofit. Lion, it's not an animal metaphor. It stands for local independent online news. And that's our focus, is building more entrepreneurial efforts around the country to try to tackle this local news crisis at the local level, which is where it is. And I think those efforts try to do that. If you replace we have to save newspapers with another form of communication from the era when newspapers were founded, which is we have to save the telegram, would anyone believe you? Would anyone look at you with a straight face and say that we need to save a certain way of communicating? That seems absurd to me, because it is absurd. Wire editors at newspapers used to be called telegraph editors, because literally that was their job, was translating information that came in via dots and dashes. There are better ways to do this. They don't involve cutting down trees. And, my frustration has been, for 20 years I spent in the, very technical part of newspapers, trying to drag them into the future, and realizing that I couldn't separate the paper from the news, and decided to focus on the new shoots of grass, which is what I'm doing.
All right, well, I'm sure we'll come back to that, but I'd like to turn to Josh. I don't want to embarrass you, Josh, but I know that in addition to your role in the media, you're also a lawyer. And engage in a lot of legal debates. And your contribution sort of took up the issue, sort of as we've been discussing here, that news gathering at some level is a public good, a public interest. And until very recently, maybe 20 years ago or less, there was a viable kind of private sector business model for a lot of this stuff that now seems severely challenged. And in the US, at least, in recent decades, the government, we've had a hard time sort of justifying any government intervention in order to sort of shift a private business model or distribution of profits, that sort of thing, even though that's precisely the issue at stake here. But you looked at kind of another tradition or legal basis for some of these interventions, and perhaps you could outline that for us and why it may be appropriate here.
Sure. So, look, I defer to the Aussies on the panel as far as kind of the granular details of the results of the bargaining code that all of us were asked to write on. And thank you, Julius, again for organizing this symposium and also this webinar. It seems to me like parts of it have certainly at least been successful. The number that I saw was that roughly 200 million Australian dollars have been transferred from Facebook and Google to news publishers. And, this is a topic that I'm actually quite passionate about. Not to kind of go off on a tangent, but on just a brief kind of biographical detail. My grandfather, who was actually also a lawyer for the first half of his career, he kind of had a mid-career transition. By the time I was growing up, he actually was the publisher of a chain of roughly 50 to 60 regional newspapers or so. And he got out of that business a long time ago. Probably around the turn of the century, but those are exactly the kind of properties that probably have been shuttered en masse over the past 20, 25 years, as we've seen this rise of this duopoly of Google and Facebook when it comes to digital advertising. So it's definitely an issue that touches home to me. the Internet Accountability Project, which is kind of a small anti-big tech nonprofit, you might call it, for which I volunteer as counsel and policy advisor, kind of formally came out in favor of the JCPA last year, which is kind of America's rough equivalent of the Australian bargaining code. It's slightly watered down. It's not quite as heavy-handed, but it's a similar idea. And I continue to think that legislation deserves support. As far as kind of the broader paradigm that you're getting at here, Julius, one thing that I have been very passionate about for the past few years when it kind of comes to Facebook and Google and what to do about these, purportedly private sector companies that increasingly exercise outright state level power. Of course, Sohrab's new book is entirely on this subject. Is the common carrier framework. That is one thing that I have been kind of increasingly outspoken about over the past few years here. And this is kind of a venerable old English common law doctrine. It basically says that if you provide a service, and to kind of borrow the phraseology of the great English common lawyer, Sir Matthew Hale, if the service is so cloth in the public interest, or, to put another way, is just so obviously redounds to the public good for better or for worse, then that will necessarily require a closer degree of regulation. And the basic kind of quid pro quo of common carrier regulation, to go back to the English common law, was that there was it was kind of a carrot and stick approach, where the stick would be some sort of non-discrimination principle, and the carrot would be you would get some sort of extra legal immunity from something. So for the railroad companies, it would be tort immunity for certain torts. One key insight that Professor Phil Hamburger has actually made here in the US when it comes to our big tech debate is that Section 230, from a big tech perspective, actually already is that carrot, and therefore kind of the correlative stick of a non-discrimination principle would really kind of fulfill the old school common carrier paradigm. So to me, that would be a more complete remedy to the problem that we're talking about here. I'm not sure that it would be a panacea, but it's something that I think would probably redound at least to the benefit of resuscitating the moribund local news industry. But by itself, as kind of a one-off legislative measure as well, I do think that the JCPA is a fine piece of legislation, and fundamentally deserving of our support as well.
Thank you. Sohrab, your piece drew on two interesting perspectives. One, your actual concrete experience at the New York Post at the time of the Hunter Biden laptop controversy, which in a sea of scandals, I think still stands out as one of the most memorable issues, kind of at the intersection of big tech and media. And you also drew on kind of larger political economic theory. And there's a lot of simplistic takes on this, and your piece was not simplistic, so I don't want to push you into a simplistic position here, but I am curious if you could illuminate kind of your perspective on the intersection of the business model side with kind of this political censorship disputes that have gotten a lot more attention.
Yeah, sure. So I relied on John Kenneth Galbraith's analysis of different forms of power. There's what he called condign power, which is very rarely used in societies like ours, where I say, Josh, do this or I'm going to beat you up. More likely to be used are conditioned power, that's ideological power. You should do what I suggest, Josh, because it represents the best of the American way, or compensatory power. If you do what I say, I will pay you, or if you don't do what I say, I won't pay you. And so those are the two forms of power that Galbraith thought were, and it's kind of an obvious point, were more common to complex industrial society. And so the experience that I went through and my then colleagues went through with the Hunter Biden story and its suppression could in some ways be described as a form of conditioned power exercised by big tech against consumers of news, right? It's Hunter, the New York Post is the conveyor of X information, but big tech tells the end user that you can't access this information. You can't even direct message it privately, what turned out to be a true and legitimate news story. Of course, conservatives were outraged about that, and it continues to ripple out in terms of a vague hostility on the part of the right about big tech power. But what's paid attention to less is the role that big tech's compensatory power plays in bolstering its condition power. Whatever you think of the ideological or partisan issues, whether you're on the left or the right, what should worry you is this sort of lopsided distribution of power between, on the one hand, these big tech platforms, and on the other, traditional news outlets. And the way that works is the Federal Trade Commission chairwoman Lena Khan put it in a really groundbreaking report a couple of years ago when she was still working on staff in Congress, was that big tech is on both sides of digital advertising transactions, which means that traditional news outlets compete with big tech as advertisers, right? They want to sell advertising, but big tech is itself also these platforms are advertising platforms. At the same time, they're also competing for content, or more accurately put, big tech just creates a situation in which users can encounter news gathered by other people through sweat equity and investment equity, but they never have to leave the big tech platform, and therefore they never have to pay the news gatherer, the person who actually put the sweat equity into it. And so the traditional outlets are deprived of eyeballs, subscriptions, ad revenue, et cetera. So that arrangement plays a part, I argue, in the kind of conditioned power that big tech plays over consumers, the ideological power it has, which conservatives are rightly riled up about, but they're not as riled up as they should be about the role that the political economy of tech and media play. Another factor that I didn't mention in my piece, and I'll shut up here pretty soon, but for American Affairs, but which I do explore because I have a chapter on the rise of news deserts and the political economy of news deserts in my book, Tyranny Incorporated, out in August from Penguin Random House, pre-order now, is the role of private equity and hedge funds and the destructive role they play when they take over news. Unlike big tech, which just decimates local news outlets, private equity and hedge funds play a different role, which is they turn existing papers into ghost papers because they sort of mine them for real assets and shed staff, such that, there was a study showing that, when private equity takes over a newspaper, its content becomes much more national in focus because it's cheaper to produce syndicated material as opposed to local news that's important to the community. Voter engagement goes down in the region, et cetera, et cetera. All these sort of negative effects that's specifically associated with Wall Street ownership of news. So besides the recommendations of the Australian model, which I support in my American Affairs essay, in my book, I also argue for barring private equity and hedge fund ownership of news entities precisely because of the role they play in democratic deliberation. But that's not part of this discussion per se. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Matt Stoller next because I know he's a big fan of John Kenneth Galbraith. But Matt, I think it's fair to call you a leader of the sort of revived antitrust movement that we've seen here in the U.S. One of the paradoxes of this one is that what the JCPA proposed to do was actually to sort of grant an antitrust exemption to one node of what we might call the sort of news value chain in order to counteract monopoly power concentration at another node, namely the internet platforms. So maybe you could walk us through kind of some of that paradox. And I'm also curious, if that model, why it's appropriate in the news case, but also if you see that model potentially being appropriate in other sectors or areas in the antitrust context as well. Sorry.
I'm very proud of myself that I started talking and unmuted myself before someone had to tell me that. So I already consider this a success. So I guess I'll start by talking about why advertising in newspapers really matters. So advertising funded newspapers are older as a business model, are older than America. And we've never had an America without ad funded news. And the reason that ad funded news matters, it's a particular kind of business model, is because advertising is a way of financing news gathering that shields the newspaper from the state, as well as from highly capitalized interest, as long as there's a diversity of advertisers and a diversity of newspapers. So without that, we're in this kind of like bold new era of like, can you have a democracy without newspapers? I mean, obviously we have like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and cable news and stuff like that, but the eyes in the city halls, right? The eyes in the state capitals, the people who are sort of the first lines of reporting on everything from like flu outbreaks to local sports to local corruption, like that's all kind of been wiped out, and not just in the US, but globally. And that's why Australia is so important. So the data I've seen, and we don't have great data, but the data I've seen suggests that the Australian law has been pretty successful. It's moved 200 million Australian dollars plus from big tech to, or actually advertising money to publishers. It's much easier to get a job as a journalist. I think the requests on job boards for journalists are up something like 40-50%. That's compared to pre-pandemic and pre-bargaining code implementation. So it's worldwide. We've tried a number of things. Europe tried a copyright regime. It didn't work. There have been a number of different experiments, and nothing has worked except this Australian law. So it would be nice if there were more data. I've talked to a number of small publishers in Australia. They're getting money. This is the one thing that we've tried anywhere in the world that has done something. Why did it work? And it's important to ask that question. And as you asked, it has to do with the fact that it facilitated bargaining by removing essentially an antitrust rule that would prohibit such bargaining. I mean, I'll talk more about the JCPA now because I understand the American context more. But the reason that advertising has been redirected from publishers to tech firms, Google and Facebook, isn't because the internet is some natural force that does this thing. It's we had online advertising that worked pretty well up until 2007, and that was 95, 2007. What happened is Google monopolized the ad market by buying up a bunch of companies and then structuring essentially one giant global ad buying and selling marketplace. They bought DoubleClick would be the big merger in 2007, but there were a number of others. And then they engaged in a series of activities that were unlawful to exclude rivals that were trying to come into the market and offer a better deal to newspapers and advertisers. And so Google gets today between 30 and 50 cents of every dollar that an advertiser puts in, instead of 1-2%, which is what you would see with an electronic marketplace like the stock exchange, or maybe 10 or 15% if you want to go back to sort of the Mad Men era of advertising when the intermediaries got a little bit more. Regardless, Google gets a massive amount relative to either of those two models. And they also get to structure advertising and move more advertising to search ads where they get 100% of it. So the reason is pretty simple. Every newspaper needs Google. They all use Google's software to get for their advertising. And Google needs news per se, but they don't need any one particular newspaper. So if I'm a newspaper or a publisher and I try to bargain with Google, they can say, whatever, these are our terms, take it or leave it. I have a million other new publishers I can go to. But now, if all those publishers could get together and say, all right, collectively, here are the terms we want, Google would have to bargain. But in the US, if you have a bunch of firms that get together and try to bargain collectively on something, that is considered price fixing, right? And we have antitrust laws against price fixing. Now, the problem with the antitrust regime in the States is that when you don't enforce laws against monopolization, but you do enforce laws against price fixing, which is what we've done, you get situations like this, which either encourages everybody to merge so that they can take advantage of the ability to bargain as a monopolist, or they just all die. Now, what this bill does is it allows newspapers to effectively become cooperative cooperatives and collectively bargain with Google, Facebook as well, but Google and Facebook have kind of like cartelized in some ways. It lets them bargain over the terms of advertising. And it gives them certain procedures that let the bargaining ensures that it's done in good faith, that there's not retaliation, and so on and so forth. Now, we have precedents for this. There are things like, say, organized labor, right, where people get together, they are allowed to collectively bargain. It could be considered an antitrust violation to allow a large group of people to get together and bargain collectively. In some contexts, like Uber in Seattle, when you have independent drivers getting together, it is considered an antitrust violation, or could be. But in labor law allows that. We also have farm cooperatives. So there's cooperatives in lots of different industries, and cooperatives are a natural way to, and I'll give this one to Sohrab, to create countervailing power. This is just, his book is on sale this fall. You should buy it. But it's about remedying a bargaining imbalance. Now, my preferred solution is a time machine to go back to 2007 and not allow Google to monopolize, right? Don't allow the mergers, don't allow the unlawful behavior, allow the market to continue essentially the way that it was, modernized with better technology, but we would essentially have a world where newspapers and publishers could flourish, and you'd have a bunch of ad intermediaries. But we didn't do that. We chose to facilitate monopolization. My second preferred scenario would be to vastly accelerate antitrust cases. There is an antitrust case against Google over its ad tech. There's actually a couple over its ad tech provisions. I would like to see that case go quickly and get done now. However, I really don't want newspapers to die because their money is being stolen by a monopolist. That's bad for lots and lots of different reasons. So a temporary, and that's the other thing about this bill, there's a 6-year sunset, right? So it's like the bill is designed basically to allow newspapers to collectively bargain for 6 years. Presumably at that time, we will have dealt with Google and we will have created a much more open marketplace where, not just newspapers and publishers, but also like people that do different forms of advertising can come into the market and can compete and ratchet down the amount of money. It's about $30 billion a year that Google takes in. Even if you move just a little bit of that back into the media ecosystem, it would, I think, have really significant impacts. So that's what the bill is designed to do. It's working in Australia, and I haven't really seen any other proposals that would do anything even remotely similar to what this bill does. And the only people who have an alternative proposal are people who say, well, we need more government funding. We need basically government funding of the news. And I think that more public funding of the news would be a good thing, but we desperately need to shield newspapers from the state. And that means that there has to also be an advertising market, or else, I don't think that a lot of newspapers or publishers are going to want to criticize the entity that is funding them. And so we need to have lots of different revenue streams. Advertising has always been a core one, and I think we should seek to preserve it because we do need to, preserve our democracy. So that's, I guess, how I'd put it. I don't know if I answered your question, but I tried to do my best.
No, that was great. I can't believe I got through 6 panelists without forgetting anyone, but I'll turn to our final panelist now. Peter Lewis, I asked your fellow Australian to talk a little bit about the recent past of the bargaining code. Perhaps you could shed some light on its likely future or where you see it evolving. I know you've expressed some concerns to me in the past about some potential issues and impacts from some adjacent regulation or things like that. But where do you see the code going from here?
Thanks, Julius, and hi, everyone. So the Centre for Responsible Technology, which I established back in 2018, was really set up to support the sensible regulation of big tech. And when this proposal came public in 2020, we leant in behind it. It's important, though, to note that the bargaining code was part of a broader package of reforms that our market regulator, which is called the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, note competition and consumer in the title, so I think it's a bit different in its breadth, came in and it did an inquiry into the market power of the digital platforms. I'm actually going to put a link in the chat because it's a remarkably erudite and readable document for something that is being come out of public policy, but also because there were 23 recommendations in all in terms of building an ecosystem to regulate the market power of big tech. The primary finding of that inquiry was, to some of the comments earlier, that the digital platforms were effectively best understood as advertising monopolies. And there was a range of measures introduced or recommended to deal with that. And there's a lovely little Venn diagram that looks at consumer protection, competition, and privacy and data protection that Rod Sims, who was the commissioner, laid out. Now, we're not naive. It was interesting that the one recommendation that was jumped on with gusto by both a Conservative government and the Murdoch media was the News Media Bargaining Code, and there was no way that was going to stop. The other parts of it, though, are still laying fallow. Things like public funding journalism, tax concessions for people that support journalism, digital literacy. There are some of the recommendations there that media companies are actively pushing back on, particularly around privacy. So it's, I watched the global debate around a news media bargaining code as if it's a panacea and it was an elegantly presented piece of legislation that just somehow Australia got right. This is a result of power politics, and it's quite a flawed rollout of the whole ecosystem. The second point to note is that the recommendation on the news media bargaining code is kind of this shadow land. There was going to be legislation that actually designated Facebook and Google as monopolies. Facebook shut down Australian news. Google threatened to jump out of Australia. And the deal the government said was, we'll go off and do your deals with the media companies, and we won't put your name in the legislation. So we've almost got this sort of principle in our laws that there is the power of government to designate platforms, but no platform is actually designated. And they went off and did their commercial in confidence negotiations. The numbers between 150 and 200 is just guesswork. We know The Guardian has increased its number of journalists by 1/3. That's great. We know that News Limited has stopped sacking staff, but not totally. And we also know they've invested heavily in other digital assets to imagine themselves as a digital platform. And we don't really know where the money's gone in terms of our other few large media companies. Although the other point to note is smaller publishers were allowed to bargain collectively, and they have had meaningful injections, but like to the extent of maybe half a journalist's job. It's not the rivers of gold at the bottom end of the market. So I guess all I'd say is a caution that if the News Media Bargaining Code is the solution, it was a solution that was developed in context, and it has been a secretive and, flawed rollout in terms of the broader reform package. The final point to note is most of the deals were 3 to 5 years. So given that they, 2021 was when the deals came through, there is an expectation that Facebook and Google won't be as generous next time. They are really buying off the government regulation, and we don't know how strongly that will occur, how much fortitude the government will have to stare them down in the next political cycle. So I don't want to put a dampener on the discussion. I just want to make sure that people understand the context of where the code came from and where it's likely to go next.
Thank you. I'll maybe direct our first question to the Australians. Not that I expect you to have intimate knowledge of every country's political context or all of the power politics that went into the JCPA or what have you, but I am curious, being at the forefront of this, what you think of some of the other similar legislation in other places, particularly the United States. Do you think that it's sort of any improvements or innovations on the Australian model, or other things that you think have kind of missed the point of what worked in Australia?
Well, if I could go first, I think the next one thing, the one that stands out is Canada, and I think there is an interesting thing to note here around national legislatures passing laws around global platforms, that there tends to be a concern about what might be described as a contagion effect, that Australia might account for 2% of Facebook's global market, but if an idea emerges in Australia, then next it will go to Canada and it will go to Europe, and so on. So obviously the Canadian online news bill is probably the current hotspot around this. I think if you were to pick up on what would be lessons from the Australian case for anyone considering something different but wanting to make changes to it. First of all, the transparency issue is a real one, that recognising that there are potentially commercial in confidence issues in play, it is nonetheless the case that the information on what is being paid to whom by which company is just not available. The second issue is around the issue that the platforms would raise around guaranteeing that the funds actually go into the production of journalism and are not simply pocketed by shareholders as dividends or go into debt recovery and so on. The third issue, and I think a very large issue, is the fact that a very large number of news publishers, particularly small ones, and I would take Chris's point from earlier in the discussion, are simply not getting the benefits from this because the negotiations are easiest to conduct with the largest organisations. So I think there are three issues that would need to be considered in any adoption of such legislation, whether it be the Canadian case or the Californian discussion.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'd add, Julius, is that that point that I think that media will always push back on anything that looks like state regulation. But in terms of this, they are asking for state intervention. And I do believe there is a social contact track that needs to be explored, and it might be an opportunity to improve other elements of our media ecosystem, which, I don't think anyone can sit here and say the status quo of media in Australia, or I suspect in America either, is something that we should be protecting valiantly. Like, this system is hugely flawed, and this should not just be a life raft or a cash handout to media companies. It should be a carrot and a stick, an impetus for media to look at the way they're operating as well. And that was the opportunity we missed in Australia, to be honest.
Yeah, maybe we can get into more of that later, but I actually just a personal question from me. When Facebook shut off news in Australia, or threatened to shut off news in Australia, that actually did make the news in the United States. And I'd just be curious for your the Australian perspective on how impactful was that? Was there a huge public backlash? Obviously, the government did alter course a little bit, but certainly a lot of politicians here are very concerned about crossing a line like that. I'd be curious what the actual impact was.
One of the things they did was not just shut out Australian news sites, but they went broader, and no one to this day knows whether that was a snafu or if it was by design, but they closed down access to the Weather Bureau on a really stormy day. They shut down access to women domestic violence hotlines. So they kind of just overplayed their hand. And so we were running the sort of other side, and the backlash, particularly when the other stakeholder, the media, is sort of the messenger as well, was just immense. It was a huge couple of, I think, the best part of a week. Interestingly, a lot of organisations that I work with on the progressive side of politics were more concerned about getting their access back to Facebook than fighting the fight against Facebook's bullying, which shows how reliant a lot of the civil society ecosystem, that countervailing power is actually, I don't think it can be housed on a site that's owned by a billionaire. And so there was a bit of a wake-up call there as well. But yeah, it was a crazy few days.
Yeah, and a good argument for Josh's common carrier there. But turning back to the Americans, a question maybe more squarely aimed at the U.S. side. it just has to do with the issues around censorship, including in kind of the legislation or legislative process of the JCPA. Josh, I believe your piece, was pretty favorable toward the Cruz amendment on the JCPA. Matt, I think you were significantly less enthusiastic about that. But I suppose the question, this issue has kind of been a major sticking point on anything. And is there a path where, these concerns are eventually resolved, or do you see the kind of partisan disputes over censorship kind of blocking, any kind of legislation at all in the U.S. context?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess I was favorable for the Cruz amendment, which would basically limit the antitrust exemption to pricing and not get into the weeds of content moderation, because it struck me as just a possible kind of realpolitik, kind of crass legislative coalition building measure. As a brief aside, I mean, someone like Ted Cruz, who, full disclosure, I've known him for years, very much was and is kind of a creature of kind of the Tea Party movement. So the fact that he is kind of talking the way that he is on antitrust, the way that he is these days, at least on big tech and kind of the threat of really private tyranny, to again kind of borrow from Sohrab more generally, I think kind of just says a lot about how the conversation has shifted and about how many of us in kind of the more kind of nationalist, realist, populist, whatever you want to call it, elements of the right really have dramatically shifted the conversation. Because around the time that I first started following Senator Cruz, I find it very hard to believe that he would have been at all favorable to anything that even smacks of possibly kind of transferring or redistributing private profits from one kind of sector of the economy to another. I mean, that would, I think, to a lot of kind of Tea Party politicians, that might have kind of smacked of kind of crony capitalism or some sort of other outdated phrase that really has no kind of a meaning or practical use in our politics in the year 2023. When it gets to kind of like this law and kind of just the various other kind of laws that various legislators have proposed to kind of rein in big tech, it's difficult to see any kind of path forward. I hate to kind of be so pessimistic about it. I happen to think that antitrust actually is the most promising possible avenue for bipartisan legislation. I mean, there have been some tough votes where House Republicans in particular have not necessarily been, shall we say, as gung-ho about a slightly more muscular or robust use of antitrust as I think the Americans on this panel might favor. I mean, there have been some kind of diamonds in the rough, like Congressman Ken Buck from Colorado, who has kind of become kind of a new right thought leader, you might say, when it comes to kind of antitrust legislation, but the votes simply aren't there. And it's kind of a crass political matter. Kevin McCarthy certainly is not there. I think Kevin McCarthy takes way too much donation money from firms like Google and Facebook to kind of see him put any kind of antitrust legislation forward. So I continue to think actually that at least for the near term, the best path forward for having anything meaningful done when it comes to reining in our big tech oligarchs is going to have to happen from a regulatory or administrative perspective. And that could entail antitrust. Matt mentioned the Google suits. Google, by the way, it's important to underscore, Google is not a partisan issue at the state level. In Congress, they flood a lot of money, and Google certainly has outsized sway. But Ken Paxton, the right-wing Attorney General of Texas, has been one of the absolute most outspoken state-level law enforcement executives when it comes to antitrust against Google. And Google, of course, is facing antitrust scrutiny, not just on digital advertising, but also just their good old-fashioned search engine, which itself is certainly monopolistic. And I think actually all 50 state attorneys general have signed on to one of those two. I forgot exactly which one, but have signed on to at least one of those two antitrust investigations. So, in my first American Affairs essay for you, Julius, a couple of years ago, I basically said that one possible thing when it comes to common carrier is that the FTC could just very simply invoke Title II of the 1934 Communications Act and say that, what Section 230 refers to as interactive computer services, i.e. these massive search and advertising platforms, qualify for common carrier regulation by sheer administrative fiat. So that strikes me as a more likely path forward than legislation for the short term, at least.
Sohrab, any thoughts?
I'm muting myself. Yeah, I guess I'm also pessimistic like Josh. I've long watched Republicans in Congress, whether they're in power in their particular chamber or not, rail against big tech power, rail against Google, sometimes even rail against Wall Street, and then what they actually do legislatively is different than the kind of notes that they sound while they're on Fox News. And that includes, for the most part, I mean, there are exceptions, but it includes the sort of neo-populists of the new right. And so that being the case, I mean, I also see the greatest hope, whether it's the antitrust avenue or another, either through the administrative agencies, or in some cases, at the risk of sounding Biden-pilled, in the same way that like Lena Khan spearheaded opposition to non-compete clauses in employment contracts. You could see the very administration that in some ways benefited from the censorship of the New York Post in the 2020 election might end up taking action that's salutary in the long term. It's kind of painful to admit, but I think it may well be the case because, but this just reflects my broader learned cynicism about GOP populism, that it's mostly sort of cultural noise and very little policy effect.
Matt, could you perhaps add some pessimism from the Democratic side, or perhaps even another approach?
Oh, I'm not even muted. I don't know. I mean, I can't tell the future. I never thought we'd get good antitrust enforcers, so that's pretty amazing. I don't know. I mean, I think we're going to reform antitrust laws in the next 5 years. I don't know when, but it seems like it's pretty necessary. And I think the GOP has moved pretty far on this. The Democrats have moved really far. It's sort of a weird dynamic. This is kind of political analysis now. The Krewson amendment, just to deal with the Krewson amendment for a second. Krewson and Klobuchar agreed on it. And I think that the censorship question is really just a sideshow, which is just like the real way that censorship is happening is by defunding most of the local press. So I think they kind of sorted that out with an amendment that I think they were both fine with. And but I think broadly speaking, is there support for constraining these dominant tech platforms? And the answer to that is not yet. I think there is on the Democratic side, it is central, but not the center of politics. So you can't come out and say, I support big tech, like that looks bad, but you can do it quietly. Most people don't support it, but like it's not the center of our politics, but it's becoming more important. On the Republican side, you have they moved so far, so fast from Trump bringing the first real monopolization case in almost maybe 10, 20 years. And that includes Obama, didn't really bring much, and George W. Bush. So that's a big deal. You got Bill Barr out there talking about it. And then in the last year or so, the kind of establishment has figured out how to weaponize some of the populist rhetoric to pull the GOP establishment back. But there is a real debate there. And I think that debate is, I don't necessarily see the kind of corporatists continuing to overwhelmingly dominate that debate as much as they have in the past. I think they've been pretty dramatically weakened. But so I'm optimistic. I think it's going to take some time. I think the voters are not they're not stupid. They can see what's going on. And ultimately at a certain point, and I focus on the GOP because I think they're the main impediment, but not the only impediment. But I think at some point, the voters are gonna, like the Republican policymakers are going to notice we have nothing to offer the voters. And the cultural noise is somewhat compelling, but it is only compelling when the Democrats are super annoying. And the Democrats are not always super annoying. So they're going to, like, just for their own political self-preservation, I think they're going to move. They've pulled back a little bit. I think they're going to move, not just here, but in lots of other areas. Like there's lots of things like pharmaceuticals and independent drugstores and grocers and all these areas where consolidation is happening throughout the economy. And I think that you see at a state level, you'll see at a federal level, the Republicans will continue to move because ultimately, Terry, you mentioned, I forgot if it was Terry or Peter who talked about how this is like power politics. It's like, that's how politics always works. And so we have powerful interests that want newspapers, right? We have powerful interests that want constraints on big tech and consolidation. Those powerful interests are not going away. So I'm optimistic about changes to antitrust. I just don't know when they're going to happen.
Could I just make a quick observation there that there is also there's a kind of almost a cultural nationalism in this as well. And in Australia, it's an interesting one. In Australia, the concerns that the news media could go the way of the US, which is seen as a great fount of fake news and misinformation. Obviously, with Rupert Murdoch being a major figure in both countries, it plays out, and that said, that there was an element of it around wanting to maintain national news organisations as an element of sovereignty, and I think we can underestimate the extent to which sovereignty issues are playing out in tech debates today. And I think sovereignty issues are playing out in tech debates today to a far greater extent than was the case 5 years ago.
Yeah, I was just going to ask the Australians, since I made you sit through this partisan political analysis here. Maybe Peter, I'll ask you just, did for example, partisan censorship play a role at all in the Australian debate, or is that just a kind of peculiar feature of American dysfunction, and that really wasn't a concern in the Australian debate? And I think actually learning more about the power politics that went into the Australian side and how that was dealt with is actually quite interesting from the US side.
Yeah, so the support for the bargaining code as a standalone measure had multi-partisan support. It had both the at the time the Conservative government actively pushing it. It had the Labor opposition actively supporting it. It even had our Greens that have a presence in our parliament supporting it. This was partly because the arguments that we've been talking about, the importance of an ongoing media, were accepted across the divide. It was also a sign of the power of the media in prosecuting their own interests. I've been working in the media for over 30 years, first as a journalist, then as a practitioner and an advocate, and I've never had the run I had in media companies as I had when I was supporting the News Media Bargaining Code. They were offering me free full-page ads, the whole deal. So there was this big full-court press going on, and it was really the media political establishment basically lining up against big tech. As I said before, I think the tragedy is it stopped at the bargaining code and it didn't do the rest of the work. So we still haven't got privacy law reform that hasn't really been updated for 40 years, and the media companies are now standing in the way of. So yeah, it was a moment. Matt is right. It is, yes, Bambi, it's about politics, but also it's also, because it is about politics, there has to be some grand bargains rolled into there eventually as well. But yeah, it wasn't polarized at all. It was across the board support for the measure, and that's why it got through.
If I could just add, there have been a few attempts to set up government mechanisms whereby government directly funds commercial news organisations. All of them have run into perhaps not unpredictable problems. That the first attempt, the Guardian was rejected funding on the grounds that it was foreign owned. Well, excuse me, I think News Corporation is foreign owned as well. So that wasn't a tenable option. Others have continued to bump up against the question of, could you really guarantee arm's length government funding of news organisations without there being some temptation to start to, favour certain organisations over others. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I would say that one of the virtues of Google and Facebook contributing to news organisations is that it allows the government to be seen to be addressing an issue without putting its own money in and without being directly involved in those sorts of decisions.
Although, just really quickly, ironically, there's always been pushback by media companies on anything that smacks of regulation, even determining what a media company is. But now the News Media Bargaining Code, you've got to pass a threshold to be a media company, so that's actually achieved that sort of threshold point, that at least there is a definition of a media company in Australia now.
Can I ask a question to the field? So one thing I've noticed about the debate over JCPA is that there's been a fair amount of hostility from the press towards the JCPA, at least in the US. And I wonder why you think that is. Particularly interested in Josh's point of view, since you're a member of the Fourth Estate, I guess.
Yeah, so I can only guess, right? But I mean, the way that the algorithms work, I mean, so many of these companies, presumably my own included, although I'm not necessarily privy to those conversations, so many of these media companies these days rely heavily on Facebook and Google, perhaps more than any other company, not just straight up punishing them or algorithmically deranking them for XYZ things. And I would imagine that that's probably part of what is going on here. I mean, especially if you're kind of a smaller outlet that is disproportionately reliant on the Google search function or your Facebook page, you don't basically want to do anything that will, I guess, just to say it bluntly, will piss off Facebook or Google. I mean, I frankly imagine that's probably part of what is going on there. Facebook and Google also, if I'm not mistaken, also donate decent sums of money to a lot of these other outlets. Axios being one example in DC takes a ton of Google money, or at least they used to as of like a year or two ago, the last time I checked. But I honestly think the fear of algorithmic punishment, and without elaborating, this is something that I've seen under the hood in my time at Newsweek. It's terrible, but because there is no common carrier regulation, because there is no non-discrimination principle, because there is mass censorship, we are all just terrified of having Google or Facebook just totally screw with our algorithms and derank us or say that we're peddling fake news or things like that. So they really do wield a ton of power, those two platforms.
Without going into details, I just want to echo that there's from mid-layer editorial staff up, there's great anxiety about the different ways that that they can mess with you, and so I say the watchword is let's pick our battles, right? We really, and so like the Hunter case was such an obvious one where it's like we're confident in the story, etc. But there are others where it's like, they can mess with. Let's not go there.
There was also with the JCPA, there was one particular conservative media organization. I won't name names, but they had a kind of a sweetheart deal with Facebook, and they ended up opposing it, and a lot of the others were for it. But I'm sure there were multiple examples of that sort of thing. Last question, very quickly. I'm going to combine sort of three into one, which is a generic question of just what the future of this legislation sort of looks like, and I'll offer you a few subpoints that you're welcome to engage with or ignore. But one is kind of at the very specific level. Do you see any fixes on issues like the transparency question, or are there specific problems that have been raised with the bargaining code more broadly? Peter mentioned this kind of prospect for new social contracts. This question's maybe a little bit more mundane, but similar. Of, do you see any new business models actually forming out of the result of the Australian model? And finally, a question which we were talking a little bit about in the pre-discussion of, does AI and any of the other new technological shifts, what does that mean for this sort of policy going forward? So I'll just open the floor for anyone who wants to go after any of that.
Well,
All right,
on the
Peter,
final
just
point,
call on you.
Julius, yeah, on the final point, the CEO of News in Australia has been opening the front on compensation for news for ChatGPT and other AIs that are using the content for machine learning. It has echoes of the arguments that we use with the News Media Bargaining Code. Again, it's hard to see how they'll be able to pursue that in a vacuum from other broader conversations about the way news is operating in Australia, and they've got a less sympathetic government in power now. So I think it's going to be a harder battle for them. In terms of transparency, it's just that, I think we made the point before, the deal was only ever half done in terms of regulation. The deals that have been done transparently have been done to avoid legislation, not because of the legislation. Finally, in terms of new models, I think, I won't say it's a tragedy, but the reality of the News Media Bargaining Code is that embeds the advertising model of journalism as a primary model. And what we're seeing are the news companies trying to become more like digital platforms rather than creating new ways of doing journalism, which might have been different if there had been a broader fund, because, ultimately what's happened is the deals that have been rolled out are not just handouts; they're contingent on a kind of phony fee for service, where the news outlets are serving up content that Google and Facebook can use in their online products. So, yeah, there are still a lot of moving parts there.
I'd agree with Peter that I think AI is the next frontier of these conversations for sure. I think there's also the question of are we talking about platforms in general or Google and Facebook in particular? And I think Google and Facebook are actually quite different companies with quite different business models. So I think Facebook has less of a clear investment in news than Google does, by the nature of social media being quite different to search. So I think that will be an issue that continues to rise. Also, just to note, these measures have come in at a time when these companies were very profitable. And I think the last couple of years have suggested we can't always guarantee that. So the profitability was partly connected to the zero interest rates regime. And the final point is that within news organisations themselves, there is a concern about what's perceived to be a degree of mendicancy, whether it be the government or the platforms, whatever, continuing to fund these entities. At the end of the day, they are commercial entities, and the question of whether you could get subscription-based models that reach beyond about 10% of the population through some kind of innovation around payment systems is one that I think is there for news organisations to actively consider.
I guess I'll just sound a note of cautious mid to long-term optimism, kind of a la what Matt was talking about earlier. It's hard to say because I think me, Sohrab, and you, Julius, as well, we're all kind of right in the thick of it, but it really does seem that the center of gravity of a lot of these conversations on the American right has slowly shifted. Sohrab, of course, is also right that there's a lot of duplicity and kind of two-faced talking out of one side of the mouth, and you go do something else and you talk about kind of just what's best for corporations. But kind of the overarching theme of my contribution to the symposium that I was building up towards, which is what I referred to, kind of borrowing my own Newsweek deputy editor Phil Jeffries' phrase from a essay he wrote, is kind of the partiality imperative. The broader idea that neutrality is not an option, that it is entirely kind of the just purview of the statesman, of the elected official, of the legislator, of the governing official to actually make choices. And in this case, a choice as seemingly or ostensibly crass as one that could result in the direct transfer of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more than that, from one to the other. That is entirely within the legitimate purview of that class of officials. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that. And that really is kind of a seismic paradigm shift. Again, kind of the votes are not currently there on the right to enact or to lead, at least on any kind of legislation of that note. But just because kind of the JCPA is not going to pass in the current Congress or perhaps the next one does not necessarily mean that there is not at least some cause for mid to long-term optimism. And that's a nice contrast to my usual kind of black-pilled, semi-pessimistic nature, at least.
Sohrab, any thoughts?
No, but I was glad someone brought up AI, and then for Peter to note that, I mean, I'm broadly skeptical that AI can replace news gathering, because I believe in that human element of, and not just because it's my job and I don't hope to be replaced by a robot, but there's an element of news judgment, of, yes, not just sort of like serviceable prose, but interesting prose that you can encounter in newspapers. And I just don't think so. The real question with AI was the one that Peter touched on, which is, again, the sort of more the question of market power and the potential for AI not to supplant human news gatherers, but again, in the same way that a decade ago, big tech began cannibalizing or exploiting the work of human news gatherers, the same thing happening with AI. That is information that is gleaned by, packaged by, presented, compiled in compelling fashion by human beings who put sweat equity into it, being, again, becoming the subject for cannibalization by another tech interest. And so the broader theme I think we should all take up is that none of this is quote unquote inevitable. Markets, the way they work, technology, all are subject to human political choice and agency. And, we should seek the greater good in these things, seek the common good, and not just go along with market or technological developments just because they are so, supposedly inevitable. They're not.
Matt, you can have the last word if you would like it.
You're a bad Galbraithian, Sohrab. He would say these things are inevitable. I want to pick up on what you said. So I'm going to read a sentence from Jake Sullivan's speech last week. Jake Sullivan is the head of the National Security Council, the White House, and he was talking about the Washington consensus of political economy, the national security consensus. He said there was one assumption at the heart of all this policy, that markets always allocate capital productively and efficiently, no matter what our competitors did, no matter how big our shared challenges grew, and no matter how many guardrails we took down. The shocks of a global financial crisis and a global pandemic laid bare the limits of these prevailing assumptions. And he's saying like that whole consensus was wrong. And I think one of the things that we have to realize in these debates is that we're doing something more bigger than passing legislation to restore newspapers. That I think is a really important thing to do. But we're rediscovering the art of governance itself. And I think there's this massive ideology that is kind of like the superstructure in the sky that dominates both the left and right in different ways, or maybe there's different flavors, that says we cannot govern, that markets are metaphysical magic institutions that just allocate. And the only thing you can do if you try to interfere with that, even the notion interfere, is to screw things up, and the market will win in the end anyway. And this is a very, very powerful ideology. obviously we know that markets are not actually one thing. They are politically structured, and how you write the rules, someone's always writing the rules, and just how you write the rules really matters. And I think as we experiment with different institutional setups for the news, and some of them are going to succeed and some of them are going to fail, and some of them are going to, I think the Australian model has been really successful. There are significant problems with it. There will always be problems with any model that you set up, but part of it is kind of like getting through this idea, this total lack of confidence that people have and that policymakers have in the ability of public institutions, of democratic institutions to structure markets to govern. And I think we are getting over that, and it's hard to see. It's like, because we're swimming in the water and we're trying to identify water, but like it is hard to see, but it is happening. And I think in that sense, like, I think that's kind of why I'm optimistic about where we're going. Like these kinds of policies, we're clearly it's probably going to pass in Canada, which is going to have significant problems there. Brazil's looking at it. There's a bunch of places that are looking at this bill. It's going to pass in different ways. It's going to work. It's not going to work. We're going to learn. There are going to be other things that are going to happen, but we're rediscovering the art of governance where we're like flabby and we're starting to work out. And that ultimately, I think, is a very positive thing.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. That brings us to the end here. Thanks to our dear friends at Google. This will be on the internet forever. And as we all agree, the issue is unlikely to go away. So hopefully it can continue to be informative. Thank you very much.